Well, very warm welcome to everybody, but especially a very warm welcome to Yianni. It's great to have you here, Yianni. I've known Yianni for quite a while, but a few years now. We were on the History Council together. So Yianni is giving sounds like a really interesting talk. You can read the title here, Beyond the Red Rock. Did you say Ikarian Revolution, Political Radicalism and the Ikarian Diaspora. And it sounds like South Australia is, very prominent in that diaspora. So Dr. Yianni Cartledge is a lecturer in modern Greek studies at Flinders University and adjunct lecturer at Tubble College. His PhD thesis was conferred in March 2024, and that explored the migration of Aegean islanders to the UK and Australia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yianni's research interests include migration and the migrant experience, diaspora studies, Mediterranean histories, particularly the British and Ottoman empires, and history of modern Greece. He's also the assistant editor of the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. So thank you, Yianni, for this.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me today, guys, and for coming along. This boat you can see here, this ship, this is the only warship of the Ikarian Revolution. It's called the Cleopatra. It was donated by the Egyptian Ikarian community, and it just pretty much patrolled the island during the 1912 revolution. It didn't have too much, it wasn't battling another warship or anything. It just sort of was around. But yeah, I love the picture of the drawing of it because it sort of really shows the independence, especially this flag here, which says autonomous Ikaria, which is showing the flag of the island of Ikaria during its very short-lived independence. Before we start, though, I'd like to acknowledge the country we're meeting on and like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging as well. So in 1945, a man called John Carapetis, who was an Ikarian living in Porphyry, applied for his nephew, Antonis Kalamboyas, who was living in a refugee camp in Cyprus at the time, to have entry into Australia. Kalamboyas, who would become a fugitive during the Greek Civil War, was ultimately denied entry into Australia due to his connections with the Greek Communist Party, the KKE. And he would also go on to write his memoir titled Ikaria, the Red Rock, you can see there, which was published posthumously in 2016. Meanwhile, on the walls of the Icarus Hall, Unley, the clubroom of the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood, there hangs a copy of the Constitution of the 1912 Free State of Ikaria, which many may gloss over when entering. This homage to the revolution within one of the diaspora's organised communities paints the picture of Ikarian independence and its persisting significance to the descendants outside of the island. This study examines the Ikarian diaspora and their political radicalism, the Ikarian Revolution of 1912, where the island seceded from the Ottoman Empire and became an independent free state for 5 months before joining Greece. It also looks at the period of radicalization following this, which included the rise of Metaxas, the Greek fascist dictator in the 1930s, World War II, which includes the invasions of Greece by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and the Greek Civil War from 1946 to 49, in which Ikaria was used as a prison island for communist exiles. And these are taken as significant milestones in the story of Ikarian left-wing radicalism. So Ikaria is a Greek-speaking majority island in the North Aegean Sea. It's not far from the Turkish coast, as you can see there. It has a long history of autonomy, and the island has consistently had a modest population of about 8,000 to 10,000 people at any time, with Ottoman census records confirming this. The island is situated between much larger islands of Samos and Foudni, Samos and Chios, sorry, and it's near the smaller islands of Foudni, which are kind of considered almost part of Ikaria, this small archipelago of islands nearby. Ikarians and people from Foudni are also considered kin when they're migrating abroad as well. So Ikaria's culture of autonomy began long before the 20th century. In the 17th century, there was a travel writer called Bishop Joseph Georgianus, who described the Ikarians as independent and irreverent of Ottoman officials. Although his assessments could have been applied to the Aegean region more broadly during this period, there is a story where the Ikarians did team up to kill off a bunch of Ottoman tax collectors at the time and kind of they took this sort of collective responsibility for doing so, which caused the Ottomans not wanting to decimate the whole island to sort of let the case be. However, official autonomy began in Ikaria during 1835 when under Sultan Mahmud II. This was likely spurred on by a prior uprising on the island during the Greek Revolution, which was driven by a deputation from Samos. Ikaria's autonomy continued throughout the Tanzimat period and was solidified by the end of the 1860s when Ottoman officials stepped back from involvement in Ikaria's local matters altogether. This was partly due by an encroachment of an Ottoman warship near the Dodecanese Islands and the Cretan revolt at the same time. So these events urged the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Stanley, to confirm the islands within the Ottoman archipelago's autonomy in 1867. So this self-governing period labelled Ikaria as one of the 12 privileged islands of the Dodecanese, although it actually wasn't part of the Dodecanese geographically. And the Ottomans had this hands-off approach to administration, which essentially took the form of a small administrative garrison, which was usually under the governance of an elected local leader. And these local leaders were sourced from all over the island, essentially. Although most of the leaders came from the few merchant families that were dealing in charcoal and tobacco. However, in Ikaria, the elites, these merchant families, weren't as kind of prominent as in other islands, and they couldn't actually secure loans or anything like that. So they were still quite close to the working class populace in terms of social status. The story is that most of them didn't trust banks, so they actually buried their money instead of investing in banks and getting loans and things like that. So the island's autonomy, though, was paired with revolutionary, utopian-like egalitarian social structures within a proudly agrarian society. Historian Maria Borelli has explored Ikaria's egalitarian and communal agrarian culture, and she links it with communist fervour during the early 20th century, which spurred on by the island's political marginalisation, poverty, and lack of urbanisation. Some have also compared Ikaria's egalitarianism along with the myth of Icarus, that flew too close to the sun, which is where the island derives its name, to the French-American utopian Ikarian movement, which derived from socialist philosopher Etienne Cabet's 1839 novel Voyage in Ikaria. However, the link between the Ikarians and these Ikarians is a little bit unsubstantial at the same time. So leading up to the Ikarian Revolution, the scene was set perfectly for the island's secession. Firstly, the population of the island had grown disgruntled with recent policy changes in the Ottoman region under the Young Turks. Additionally, there had been a speaking tour on the island from Enos's proponent Konstantinos Myrianthopoulos. He was a Cypriot scholar and he was a nephew of the Archbishop of Cyprus. And he was also a close friend of some Greek revolutionary political figures. There was also inspiration drawn from similar cases of independence in the Aegean, such as the much larger islands of Samos and Crete. Samos existed as the Principality of Samos from 1834 to 1912, and Crete as the Cretan state from 1898 to 1913. In fact, at the time, the Australians' 1911 census actually included Samos and Crete as nations of birth that were being counted separate from the Ottoman Empire and from Greece, which showed their internationally recognised autonomous statuses as well. So the mix of a dissatisfied population and Myrianthopoulos' revolutionary ideas created the right climate for a revolt in the early 1910s. Under the veil of the Italo-Turkish War, the Ikarians saw the perfect opportunity to commence their revolution. On the 16th of July 1912, the revolutionary force of 50 men, led by a man called Yianni Malakias, who you can see here, kind of a bust of him in the main town, adorned with a wreath. He assumed the role of general, and another man, Yorgos Fountoulis, kind of took the second role. And Together with their men, they marched on the town of Evdelos and seized the Ottoman garrison. The next day, the 17th of July, which was St. Marina's feast day, the revolutionaries were pursued by a small Ottoman resistance of 9 soldiers, led by Ottoman civil servant Thucydides Effendis. The revolutionaries swiftly outmaneuvered the Ottomans near the village of Chrysostomos and proceeded to storm the island's capital, causing the Ottomans to surrender and proclaiming the Elefthera Politia Ikarias, or the Free State of Ikaria. There was one casualty during the event, a man called Yorgos Spanos. Spanos was an important figure because his family would stay prominent in kind of Ikarian politics for a long time. However, he was likely killed by friendly fire, they believe, so he was the only casualty. The neighbouring islands of Furni Kosion, the archipelago, were also liberated at the same time to join the Free State. And you can see the flag of the Free State of Ikaria here, that was proudly raised and still is used on government buildings in Ikaria to this day. So under the presidency of Ioannis Malakias, he was the general that led the revolution. He was also a doctor as well at the same time. And under the generalcy of Yorgos Fountoulis, the islanders had their own constitution, as we saw at the beginning, their own flag, stamps, armed forces, and anthem. The revolution, including the flag and anthem, was depicted in a popular poster that was shared during 1912, which you can see here. This poster included a map of Ikaria. You can see the warship, the Cleopatra, in the background. You can see the goddess Nike flying above, goddess of victory Nike. She was sort of flying above this woman who's seen as the embodiment of Ikaria, sort of signalizing victory here. But it's also a play on Ikaria's local name, which is Nikaria. So the Nick means victory from Nike. By November, however, the island was experiencing a famine and embraced Greece's prime minister's claim on the Aegean Islands. So during the Balkan Wars, the islanders welcomed the Greek fleet on the 4th of November, 1912, who raised the Greek flag on the island. And this ended the short-lived Free State of Ikaria. So it was a 5-month, I guess, experiment. This episode, though, sparked a spirit of radicalness on the island. During the 1930s, Ikarians were generally sympathetic to the Communist Party in Greece, the KKE, most likely as a reaction to the fascist dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas. These sympathies only increased with the shooting of an Ikarian man, Stamatis Salas, by Greek police in 1936. He was shot because he was not paying his taxes, but this was due to him having tuberculosis at the time. This led to a protest on the island, which led to the 6-month imprisonment of 35 Ikarians, including 9 women who participated. And they were all sent to Samos jails on the nearby island. And this is a photo from Samos jail of some of the prisoners. One woman, Fotini Leses, she was the daughter of Yorgos Spanos, who was killed during the revolution. She was one of those sentenced, and she's an important figure. She eventually ended up coming to Adelaide. The 1940s only solidified left-wing ideologies on the island, especially with the invasions and occupations of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany during World War II. And this was followed directly by the Greek Civil War from 46 to 49, where Ikaria became an island of exile for communists. Up to 15,000 people were sent to Ikaria during the Greek Civil War as in exile, including high-ranking KKE members, but also left-wing cultural figures such as the musician Nikis Theodorakis. This earned Ikaria the nickname of the Red Rock, and which is carried through to this day. So leading up to the Ikarian Revolution, an Ikarian diaspora began growing globally at the same time, notably in the United States and Egypt, although some arrivals began in this period in Australia as well. Around the time of the revolution, the United States had a staggering 3,000 Ikarian arrivals between 1899 and 1924, although most came between 1909 and 1916, with 500 Ikarians alone arriving in the US in 1916. And for a population of 10,000 people, these were huge numbers leaving the island. Most settled in the mid-Atlantic region, with Pittsburgh and elsewhere in Pennsylvania and West Virginia being key places of settlement. Meanwhile, Egypt had around 570 Ikarians between 1898 and 1911, mainly in Cairo and Alexandria. These numbers would not be matched in Australia until after World War II. The overwhelming majority of this early diaspora were working class labourers, though, and working within the farming, maritime, and particularly charcoal, steel, mining industries, which fostered proclivities towards radicalism and unionism as well. So the affluent Egyptian branch of the diaspora was a particularly active supporter of the revolution and even donated the ship, as mentioned, the Cleopatra, for the revolutionaries to use during 1912. A member of the Cairo-based Ikarian community, a lawyer named Chrysostomos Fountoulis, he raised the idea of an independent Aegean state, combining the Ottoman and Italian Aegean islands following the Ikarian Revolution. This didn't eventuate though. Leading up to the revolution, there were even communications between members of the Egyptian diaspora and with the United States, with Greek ministers and nobles in Greece as well, such as when there was suspicion of news out of Ikaria being censored by the Ottomans just prior to the Young Turk Revolution. Egypt essentially had been a center of Ikarian diasporic community growth since the late 19th century, with both Alexandria and Cairo housing communities. And as early as 1898, the Ikarians of Alexandria had formed the Ikarian Brotherhood, which you can see here. While an official Cairo community, the Ikarians in Egypt Brotherhood was formed by 1903. And these brotherhoods were essentially places of kind of community meeting, usually with a hall, sometimes connected to a church, places where they could host events, celebrations, and kind of, be points of contact when other migrants would arrive. Essentially, the Cairo and Alexandria Brotherhoods were two wings of the same community, and the Alexandria branch likely planted the Cairo branch, as became the model for other Greek fraternities worldwide. Another center of community was the Cafe Bar Ikaros, which was an Ikarian cafe and lodging house, which was located on the cosmopolitan Malika Farida Street in Cairo around the 1960s, until around the 1960s. Egypt was also a staging point for Ikarians that wanted to migrate further, such as to the US and eventually to Australia as well. Interestingly, in Egypt, many Ikarians began moving from working to middle class, especially in the cases of certain prominent families who had members that owned cafes, bars, and factories and became educated professionals. Some became pharmacists, doctors, and lawyers as well in Egypt. The political leanings of the community are somewhat unclear here in the record. However, what is clear is that the existing Egyptian diaspora was both a financial and ideological supporter of the Ikarian Revolution, Ikarian independence, and ultimately Ikarian union with Greece as well. The United States was another such nation where Ikarians formed a distinct diaspora, and they became the initial major focus of the early Ikarian migrants. Starting in the late 19th century, but especially in the early 20th century. Most scholars attribute a man called Lukatsos as the first Ikarian migrant to the US. He arrived in about 1850, but there's no real records of his kind of life in America after that point. The strongest early pull force for Ikarians, however, were the coal mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where they utilized their laboring skills and worked alongside other islanders, particularly from Chios, Kalymnos, and Rhodes. These early migrants were mostly single men who eventually established communities and founded Orthodox churches, such as the Holy Trinity Church at Ambridge and at the Church of Assumption at Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, by 1918. So in Pittsburgh, as you can see, a group of Ikarians here in Pittsburgh. I think these men were celebrating a name day celebration here of one of them. The Ikarian concentration became kind of overwhelming in Pittsburgh. The growing steel industry and industrializing nature of the city became more attractive than the coal mines, and Ikarians quickly found diverse work there. Steelwork also drove islanders to Virginia and Ohio as well, where communities were formed. In 1910, there were 200 Ikarians working in the steel industry in Allegheny County alone, of which Pittsburgh is the county seat. Other areas of Allegheny County were also hotspots, including Verona, which had 350 Ikarian families in the early 20th century. So the Pittsburgh Ikarian community soon formed their own brotherhood, the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood of America, in 1903. Ultimately, brotherhoods became houses of discussion and thought for the early Ikarian migrants and their descendants, especially during tumultuous periods as well. Into the 1930s, the Ikarian diaspora in the United States was similarly politically charged and like their compatriots on the island, with left-leaning politics taking the forefront. And during the interwar period, Ikarian American steelworkers were actively joining their local Communist Party branches as well as unions. Ikarian clubs in Warren, Ohio and Youngstown, Ohio were hosting speeches from the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Gus Hall, as organized by Ikarians Elias Vioras, Pete Sarnas, and Stefanos Tsemengas. Hall, Vioras, Sarnas, and Tsemengas would go on to organize the Little Steel Strike of 1937 against the Republic Steel Corporation, where 10 strikers were killed by police, and Tsemengas was deported due to his involvement. And Tsemengas would go on to be an anti-fascist volunteer in the Spanish Civil War after this. So the Ikarian diaspora can be seen as more of a, in Australia, can be seen as more of a product of the revolution rather than a support to the revolution, unlike the earlier communities in the US and Egypt. Before 1910, there are only 3 Ikarian arrivals in Australia, and they all went to the eastern states, those 3 men. 1910 saw the first Ikarian arrivals to South Australia, though, where the community would eventually exponentiate beyond the rest of the country. The first recorded SA arrival was a man called John Varsamis. He arrived in 1910 and settled at Port Pirie, as did most during the 1910s and 20s. Varsamis ran the famed Pantheon Coffee Palace in Port Pirie on, I think, Florence Street. The majority of the decade's arrivals, however, happened after the revolution and were driven by the turmoil of the period. And 1914 in particular saw an influx of Ikarian migrants. Almost all arrivals during the period were labouring males, and almost all were employed by the BHP smelters in Port Pirie. The 1916 secret census of Greeks in Australia testified to this, and this had an identifiable 24 Ikarians listed Australia-wide at the time. 20 of those were in SA, and 19 of those worked at the BHP smelters. Some numbers here. As much as a much larger and demographically diverse number of Ikarians arrived in the 1920s and 30s, which included family units. And by 1945, there were at least 257 Ikarians in Australia. 195 of those were in SA. It should be noted that the numbers, though, cited in this section are minimums. There were many undocumented ship jumpers from Ikaria who settled around SA, and particularly in Port Pirie. These numbers also reflect those that were Ikarian by birthplace, and it's hard to find numbers on Ikarians born in Australia at the time, as well as Ikarians born elsewhere, such as Egypt, who we do know that there is evidence of many people born at this time. So the Ikarian diaspora's political consciousness rose sharply during the 1930s after the community had 2 decades of establishment. And from the 1940s, political activism emerged within the diaspora in the context of growing fascist ideologies in Europe and the end of global financial hardship during the late 1930s. In 1938, an Ikarian South Australian historian, Michael Tsunis, arrived with his mother and siblings to Port Lincoln, SA, aboard the Escobino. Tsunis's father had already been living in SA since 1926. I believe Tsunis did his PhD at Adelaide here in the 1970s or 80s. According to ethnic community radio broadcaster George Zangalis, he stated that Tsunis, like other Ikarians, began to learn his Marxism in the early 1940s from ordinary working-class Greek migrants. Before World War II, the diaspora were very poor, mostly unemployed. It was hard times. When the war broke out, people spoke up about politics. Tsunis and Zangalis have both emphasised that many Ikarian families became members of the CPA, Australia, Communist Party of Australia. During World War II, the CPA's newspaper, The Tribune, published a cablegram condemning the internment of Greek anti-fascists by the British, and this was signed by an Ikarian Australian private Triantafylos Kotsonithis, among other Greek Australians serving in the armed forces. The Tribune also closely followed developments during the Greek Civil War and even made connections between Ikarians in SA and the KKE in Greece. This included discussion of Ikarian migrant Fotini Lesses, who we mentioned before, who was the sister-in-law of a KKE revolutionary leader known as Captain Marcos Vafiadis. However, it should be noted that Fountoulis' sister was only a nurse and probably partner to Vafiadis and not actually his wife, as was reported in the papers, as she was serving as a nurse for the Greek National Liberation Front during the Civil War. Tsounis himself also continued his activism post-World War II, which included writing columns for the Greek newspaper Neos Kosmos, which was initially a left-leaning Greek language newspaper based in Melbourne, which gave updates on Greek community activities in SA, as did Fountoulis Lesses's son, John Lesses, who became the reporter for Whyalla between 1961 and 64. He used the pseudonym Parikos, meaning observer. So he had this kind of pseudonym as he published. ASIO had actually been monitoring Neos Kosmos's activities between the 50s and 60s as well. More broadly, left-wing circles in Australia held interest and memory for Ikaria and particularly the Greek Civil War exiles. During the Civil War, the Tribune regularly updated its readers. This included a 1947 republished article written by Ava Patsalidis. She was a relative of a KKE Central Committee member, Mitsos Patsalidis. Ava noted that among the 150 Democrats confined in the 2010s of the small concentration camp on Ikaria, there are 5 women. They are Nitsa Rebinsika, whose husband and brother were executed by the Germans, Lambrini Kapiani, whose husband was murdered by the Italians, the Spina Maka Anna Hasapi and myself. The tents are dreary, dirty, and ragged. We sleep on the ground and wake up clammy with damp. We have no lavatories. Ava had actually been imprisoned twice, firstly by Metaxas and again during the Civil War. And a similar recount had been published earlier that year from another exile known as Athanasopoulos. The Tribune also celebrated the escape of exiles, such as Mitsos Patsalidis, who managed to escape from a ship that was taking him to Ikaria in 1947. It also acknowledged the passing of key Greeks on the island, such as a General Evripidis Bekourtsis, who committed suicide in Fountoulis after the harsh conditions. Statistics were also offered in the Tribune, such as that the Royalists had deported 46,000 Greeks to Ikaria and other barren islands in 1948, and that 12,000 Democrats were thrown onto the barren rocky island of Ikaria. And here's a photo of some political exiles on Ikaria receiving their rations. So many Greek community-based workers and unionist movements emerged in SA during the 1940s or just after, with Ikarians often becoming key members. One is the Greek Workers' Education Association, Platon Society, which was formed in 1957. This caused ASIO to monitor many Ikarians that were active in various left-wing circles during the 40s and 60s. This monitoring was not exclusive to the Ikarians and follows a pattern of suspicions around migrant communities in the Anglosphere. In fact, the Greek communist, his name was Achilles Demetriadis, had actually been deported from Australia as early as 1925 due to being an undesirable alien and supposedly a Soviet agent. And this was possibly one of the earliest deportations Australia conducted. Platon had an especially strong Ikarian presence that has been memorialized as a key element in the organization's founding and activity. This is an image from the late 60s displayed on the cover of Platon's 40-year anniversary booklet, and it features 11 youth members of the organization that are there. This illustrated not only the strong Ikarian presence in the organization, but also the importance of that presence, especially when reflecting on Platon's history. Platon ultimately became an active voice for the SA Greek and Cypriot communities and would protest instances when migrants had their visas or naturalizations denied, usually on the basis of political affiliation. Main cases that they protested were the case of Platon and long-term Adelaide resident Steve Pappas, who was denied naturalization in 1965 after living in Australia for about 20 years. And Cyprus, a Kel Party General Secretary, Andreas Fantis, who was denied a visa to visit Australia in 1964. The organisation regularly featured in the Tribune, such as when Platon members participated in the 8-hour day march in October 1961, or in 1972 when they demonstrated against the arrival of Greek junta ambassador Stephanou to Adelaide. They also published poetry and creative expressions. There was a poem by one that stands out by John Lascelles, the son of Fortuny Lascelles, who was published in 1968. Additionally, the Ikarian historian Michael Tsounis was actually the founding president of Platon, so he was there, and he published an article against the junta in 1969 that did spark some debate as well. Ultimately, Platon and its members were linked to the broader Ikarian and Greek communities of SA, as well as the broader left-wing circles and issues, and were supported in part by the radicalisation of Ikarians between the 1910s and 40s. Beyond the 1950s, the groundwork had been laid for a politically active diasporic community, with the Ikarians' activism continuing into the 70s and 80s. So despite the significant community growth since the 1910s and the emerging political consciousness, the Ikarian community did actually not formally organise themselves until 1958, with the foundation of the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood of Australia. This was a milestone for the Ikarian South Australian development and a transitionary period between pre-World War II diaspora and the post-World War II community. At the same time, there were 260 new Ikarian arrivals in Adelaide, totaling the Ikarian-born community of SA above 500, and numbering beyond 1,000 when taking their children into consideration. Neos Kosmos, the Greek newspaper, in 1959 published an extended article written by a man called Paraskos Kalamboyas, detailing the mission of the Brotherhood, which was to support its members financially, support the causes on Ikaria, including a new hospital, strengthen the Greek communities of Port Pirie and Adelaide, and foster relations between Australians and Greeks. This is the inaugural committee of the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood, and Paraskos Kalamboyas, who kind of advertised the aims of the community, was brother of Andonis, who was denied a visa into Australia. The Brotherhood itself had been based at the Icarus Hall only since 1986 and has annually commemorated the Ikarian Revolution since its founding by hosting a Panegyri, a traditional festival, with Ikarian Independence Day, the 17th of July, being a preferred celebration over Greek Independence Day, the 25th of March. In fact, an Ikarian Independence Day festival was the first event held by the Brotherhood after their foundation. The revolution was the only celebration enshrined in their constitution as well, and Article 18 reads, the Brotherhood celebrates the 17th of July, holiday of Saint Marina, the day of the island's liberation. It participates in national celebrations with using a triangular banner bearing in the middle the flag of Ikaria, and Icarus's fall and the flag of the Ikarian state. And you can see these items in the back that need to be hung up during Independence Day. Other frequent community events were instituted, including an annual picnic, which had its origins before the Brotherhood's incorporations in the early 1950s. The picnic probably derived from earlier Pan-Greek fellowship picnics that were held in Adelaide and Port Pirie. Usually they're organised by the Greek Orthodox Community of SA or the Port Pirie Greek community. In 1960, the Ikarians also joined the CPA's Adelaide branch's Australia Day picnic at Lofty Park, Mount Lofty, where they entered a Greek Ikarian volleyball team into the event. Additionally, the community fundraised money for the construction of a new hospital in Ikaria, which was held through a dance they held in November 1958. And this was the community's second festival after the Revolution Festival that they held earlier that year. So in 1967, Neos Kosmos, Greek newspaper, published a large article titled Ikaria, an island with centuries-old democratic traditions of freedom, which linked Ikaria's political consciousness and politically conscious diaspora to the island's historical autonomy, culminating in the 1912 revolution and subsequent events on the island, such as the exiles during the Greek Civil War. This illustrated not only a common awareness of the role of the revolution, but also the broader Greek opinions of the uniqueness of the Ikarians as well. Ultimately, the legacy of the revolution spurred on a politically conscious diaspora, and the revolution itself, which was a unique event, was evidently the culmination of regional turmoil, economic pressures, and Ottoman policy, and the island's legacy of agrarian and communalist cultural norms and long-term autonomy. It left an imprint of autonomy and radicalism on the islanders, even those that migrated. And here's a great picture. You can see the armed forces of the island of Ikaria led by Stavros Fountoulis. At the same time, all these factors contributed to the proliferation of a global Ikarian diaspora, which had been growing in the United States and Egypt since the late 19th century, and was emerging in Australia at the same time as the revolution. These Ikarians continued to carry revolutionary tendencies, which stem from growing far-left movements on the island, particularly socialist and communist ideologies, especially during the 30s and 40s. These in turn were no doubt counter-reactions in opposition of the fascist Greek government under Metaxas and the invasions of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany during World War II and the subsequent Greek Civil War, and the prominence of embracement of the communist exiles in Ikarian society. So today, the diaspora is similarly still politically conscious, however, significantly more moderate when compared to their home island. And in recent years, descendants in Australia and the United States have been involved with the Labor and Democrat parties, respectively. We've had a few people of Ikarian descent run for politics in Adelaide. In all, the history of Ikaria is inseparable from both its revolutionary and left-wing histories and the prominent diaspora that emerged and stayed connected with the island during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Here you can see the Icarus Hall as it stands today. There's actually a big sign now that is here in the front, so we had to edit that out. But besides that, it's the hall is still an active house for the Ikarian community. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Yianni. What an incredible history. I knew none of that, I have to say. So is there questions for Yianni from the audience? Yeah, French.
Oh, no, go on. No, you go first. You go first. Well, thanks very much indeed. It was truly marvelous visuals. I just wondered a bit about sources. Can you say something about, is there correspondence and also state surveillance sources? What about security surveillance of the Ikarian?
Thanks, Will. Yeah, great question. The sources are there, especially the correspondence sources are very difficult to access.
Yeah.
There isn't that many.
Yeah.
Often through newspapers, you get this patchwork of kind of quotations. Someone said this, someone said that.
Yeah.
In Greece, there are some decent archives emerging. However, a lot was destroyed during Greek Civil War and then the Junta years, so there isn't really much to draw on in terms of from Greece. Anything that left Greece is probably catalogued in where if it went to the US or to Australia. However, there are a lot of ASIO files directly for Ikarian Australians, which I've been trying to actively open up to see what's in them. A lot of redacted stuff in there, but yeah, there are a lot.
Yeah.
So you have been
what
able
about state special branch?
Are
they all gone? Are all those files been destroyed?
virtually
The Dunstan thing?
virtually I haven't been able to access anything
No.
there, or anything significant. A little bit on Michael
It's a
Stewart,
huge
but that's
contrast
all.
with the UK. I've just been reading Michael Braddock's biography of Christopher Hill, and there, the whole, you can sort of trace almost daily accounts of what he's doing and who he's seeing and who's visiting him and so on.
Yeah. Actually, and I did find some UK files from Q that had the British were surveilling a few of the KKE members on Ikaria. So there were a few from Q that I actually used in this. Just because there was especially the exiles it was during their time on the island in that sense. Yeah. But yeah, from the Australian perspective, there's not really much, unfortunately. But yeah.
Just a quick follow. So have you been able to access the ASIO files? They've been heavily
redacted. So there's a lot of black.
Was it difficult to get access to? Like, did it take a long time?
Yeah, I had to do that process of requesting them to be opened. They're pretty much all of them came back as open with exception. As they come back. So heavily redacted, usually the parts that I wanted to read were redacted. So it's literally just names and dates pretty much to the most part, and lists. There were a couple like events they were monitoring that they had lists of all the attendees. which is really interesting. But yeah, in terms of like correspondence and things like that, it's pretty, especially, you know, some of the files are like 200-300 pages long, and most of it's redacted. So
Yeah, Brenton?
Oh, I was wondering about the, I guess, reaction to the Ikarian community being against the junta and kind of stuff from Greek diaspora or Greece, if there's any kind of information like that.
yeah, so that junta period, Greek military government, was a kind of real flashpoint, I guess, for the community here, because they stood in opposition to the military government, where mainstream Greek kind of Greek diaspora was somewhat in support because they were financially supported by the Greek government. So there was vested interest. Because of this was partly fueled the split that happened in the Greek communities. Even though it had already occurred, the split is kind of solidified the split in the Greek community in Adelaide, which still exists this day. There's kind of two Greek communities in Adelaide. So this was part of the kind of debate. Most Greeks in Adelaide, though, were very moderate, so there wasn't any extreme junta supporters here, I would say. But because of that financial flow, there wasn't a lot of backlash against the junta either. So groups like the Ikarians and a few other smaller pockets that did kind of stand in opposition to it were heavily kind of ostracized from broader Greek events for a short period. And I've talked to a few descendants and people that were around in those times, and they've sort of said there was this kind of, you couldn't go to certain events during those years, during the junta years. I think it looked a lot worse in Melbourne, though.
Okay.
Yeah, just because of the size of the community than it did here. Just because at the same time the community was so small, they had to still try and stay linked. But
Yeah, David?
Several about Ikaria as a place that did come from, particularly in that around the time of the revolution and the years after that. What was its relation to the displacement of people out of Asia Minor in the 20s? Like, did Ikaria place that people came to in that period?
Great. And for context, David's mentioning the exodus from Asia Minor into Greece in 1922. A lot of them did arrive in Ikaria, a lot of people from Asia Minor. Some families did settle on the island and were quite welcome. However, a lot used it as a transitionary period to get to Athens, a place to get to Athens, essentially. Ikaria didn't have any natural harbours. This is the other problem. It was a very isolated island. So people that were arriving in like kind of dinghies, like small boats rocking up onto the beaches. So there weren't giant numbers. Most probably went to Samos, which was the bigger port nearby, the neighbouring island, and then went to Athens. However, there are some families there that descend from the Asia Minor refugees. One family owns a big Turkish delight factory on the island. So, my cousin actually works there, but there were some that integrated very heavily into Ikarian society. And then some of that have taken the next jump to Australia, 30, 40 years later down the track. So,
Put a couple of questions. So with the, people being exiled to Ikaria, how were they supported? Like is it, what sort of farming, what sort of agriculture was it on Ikaria, or was it just so connected with the neighbouring islands and things that it was just, supported by that, or the government? Or
good question. The exiles on Ikaria were supported by the population. Essentially, Ikaria is quite a barren island. It is very heavily terraced, so there's a lot of like artificial farming that isn't natural farming happening there. But it was prone to famines, the island, very heavily, and relied heavily on seafood, fishing. And because of no big harbours, there wasn't huge shipments coming in of food and as well. So the locals virtually were supporting the exiles, who outnumbered the locals at the time, really, which is quite amazing. And they quite befriended them, and a lot of the exiles in their memoirs have sort of thanked the Ikarians for their kind of help during that period. The Ikarian diet itself, though, is heavily plant-based. It's not they don't have a lot of access to meats. They do have a little bit of pork, but mainly goat would be the main meat they would eat. So, because of the nature of the island, it's literally just a mountain in the sea. It's a rocky mountain, so it can just sticking out of the ocean. They really didn't have a lot, so a lot of it would have been a lot of their food was based off of herbs and things like that they could access. So, from one memoir I read that they were fed stinging nettles.
Yeah.
That was a common food they used, boiled in hot water, and that kind of got them through a lot of hardships. Yeah, so it was a very limited diet. Yeah,
Very hospitable of those people.
yeah.
I've got another question. So, with the people that came to Port Pirie, is there still quite a community at Port Pirie? And I know there's a woman, you probably know who she is, but who was trying to do oral histories with the community at Port Pirie. Do you know anything about that Port Pirie community now today?
They're still very active. A lot of the grandkids of the Port Pirie Ikarians have moved to Adelaide for opportunities. So a lot of them are here now. But the Port Pirie community is still very active. They had their 100-year anniversary last year.
Yeah.
So there was big celebrations out there. They published like a book and things like that. But the community is still very tight knit there. In Port Pirie, the Ikarians are a lot more heavily integrated with the other Greeks in Port Pirie. Or in Adelaide, they're a bit more separate, I guess. The oral histories, they are slowly collecting. They're doing good work there, all the oral histories. But interestingly, because most of the Port Pirie Greeks arrived in the 10s and 20s, the oldest generation were actually born in Australia as well. There, so they're sort of up to fourth generation. Even I think one family has 5 generations born in Port Pirie now. They've said so. But a lot of them now live in Adelaide and linked back in here as well.
And people still go back to Ikaria, like the families still go back, and they still have land back there and property back there.
100%, they still have properties, land that they travel back to. One family I know has had a big farm that they left to come to Port Pirie, and then now they've sort of built like a house there for the extended family, and they go back. I think that traveling back to Ikaria has become a lot more common in the last 20 years. So for a long time, it was very rare to travel, I guess, just distance, but
so people still feel really connected to that place. And can I ask one more? So what is your connection? So what's your connection?
So my connection is my mum's family is from Ikaria. My grandparents came in the post-World War II migration, so they weren't as such part of this early story, I guess. However, my great-grandfather did arrive in Port Pirie in 1911. He lived for about 20 years there and then went back to Greece. So he did become a naturalised British subject at the time. So this is my connection. My family wasn't politically involved in any of the movements. I'm just sort of got interested through knowing people in the community, seeing the paths that they took, which were very different. At the same time, I should say some Ikarian families weren't politically involved. They actually some took a very different path and quite capitalistic in Adelaide as well. So there's kind of two paths some took. Probably know some big family names are in Adelaide that have done very well. So there's these two kind of lines we could say. Essentially that's my link to the island in that sense. And I just sort of when I went back there when I was 18 went with my family, so kind of trip back, I found it very interesting to see a different flag being flown than in other parts of Greece, and I thought this is a really interesting story that hasn't really been officially told, I guess. So
Fantastic. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I'm not a historian, I'm a linguist. I'm also interested in Greek and diaspora. So you said that the Ikarian community here in Adelaide is pretty close-knit, and a little bit different from the other Greek communities.
For sure.
So how alive is the language today in the younger generation, third, fourth generation?
Good question. It is still heavily pushed in the third generation. So I grew up
For events and
all events are hosted bilingually
Yeah.
generally these days.
Oh, it's the same in the Greek community, yeah.
In the broader, Greek school is very much ingrained in, into young
Yeah, but they
Ikarians,
go
right?
to a regular Greek school, right? But
Of course, with
so
other,
that's not some services provided within the community.
you're
It's too
correct.
small to-
It's too small. I don't think they ever had their own Greek school
Yeah.
in terms of language. They usually used the Greek Goxa, the Greek Orthodox
Yeah.
Greek schools in the city. That was the main one. They do have a Greek dancing troupe though, so they still have cultural practices that they do, which has just been sort of revitalized the last 5 years. That's in terms of that though, like as you know, probably a lot of diaspora communities, most of the committee members, most of the people organizing things are getting quite old,
I know.
and there's not a lot of people to pass the baton on to in terms of keeping the community alive. However, there is a bit more interest. The Ikarians are one of the exceptions in the Greeks. There is some young interest. The Cypriots are similarly got young interest
I know, that's what I'm working with, actually. Go see someone in-
from the city. They're one of the few that may hopefully survive the transition.
Yeah.
In the next 10 years or so. Yeah.
That was my final question.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of tension of them flying their own flag within kind of Greek Kingdom or anything like that? Is that an issue?
I did hear that they've been told not to fly
Yeah.
their flag on government buildings, but they're so irreverent there that they don't really care. They just fly it. There is tensions there. They are regularly told. However, even today, the Greek government's presence on Ikaria is very minimal. It's very similar to the Ottoman presence on Ikaria, so they're very much left to their own devices. There isn't great infrastructure still on the island. I think Athens sends 2 police officers for the island. That's about it. But there is a military base now on the island as well, strategically placed, facing Turkish coast.
More than 9 soldiers?
I don't know. Maybe 10.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Yianni.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.